Naughty Dog today is known for creating these granular, cinematic, and enticing characters and stories, but this wasn't always the case. 3D platformers were their go-to, a mashup of creative perceptions and light-hearted goofiness. Either it be the innovative Crash Bandicoot or the intriguing Jak and Daxter, the original core never stuck to creating something outside of this box. This was until Uncharted Drake's Fortune. This game would go on to spark one of the greatest video game trilogies on the PS3 and a system-selling, incredibly well-made finale to it all on the PS4. But today we're looking at the roots of the series, where it all began, the initial birth of a legend, the birth of Nathan Drake. Uncharted 1 is a swift and grand turn from what Naughty Dog was known for, especially in terms of a presentational and graphical connotation. The game is realistic, detailed, and it truly feels alive in the notions of the real world. It's benevolent, and its atmosphere, environments, and overall way in fidelity is something truly astounding by 2007 standards. Today, a lot of the graphical notions can look outdated, but that's definitely not a larger derivative in taking away from the experience. It doesn't scream out any outdated textures, details, or environments. Instead, it crafted a way for other games like it to build upon its foundation. Uncharted Drake's Fortune can still to this day look like a beautiful game. The environments in it of themselves are definitely not outdated. The waterfalls, the large-scale terrain to climb upon, and the ancient architecture all have this sense of adventure, because Uncharted truly is an adventure, a hunt of sorts. I won't touch upon that here though, but in retrospect to that aspect of the game, the presentation can really uphold a greater sense of beauty and life into the world and make the adventures ever more endearing in the long run. The atmosphere of each area is pinned down exceedingly well, much in part due to the game's art style and graphics, but also the music and the environments which envelopes the different areas and truly immerses you into the adventure. The music is fantastic, as it always is with Naughty Dog. It definitely doesn't match up to something like The Last of Us and its beautiful yet haunting soundtrack, but it has its own charm, although it is quite simplistic to what is featured in games like The Last of Us. It works in giving the player another adversary, in immersing them further into the world of Uncharted, and it surely does it in a way that immensely benefits many other aspects of the game in terms of its presentational value. More of what adds value to this is the facial animations, expressions, and the fluid movements of the characters and the player themselves. The game was one of the first to use what is called a cell microprocessor to allow for such to happen and give the game a sense of more responsive and intuitive player control. Keep in mind, Uncharted was the first game that Naughty Dog had to develop using the newfound power of the PS3. That's why the game can still look great to this day, as a monumental leap in power, fidelity, and overall performance that was caused by the transitional period between the PS2 and the PS3 gave Naughty Dog a wider arsenal of tools at their disposal, which allowed them to create a game that at that point was pretty damn photorealistic. That's why it made a lot of sense for them to move on from Jak and Daxter and use the new power to push it to its fullest potential to really achieve a great and innovative product, something they'd also do again at the end of the PS3 generation with the still incredible looking Last of Us. The new engine and console made it possible for lighting, character animations, and overall textures and fidelity to be truly the greatest of that time. I think that's one of the largest factors as to why the game still looks pretty decent today, as utilizing the pure power of the PS3 made the game's presentational value future-proof for quite an amount of time, which other games can also attest to, but maybe not to the level of Naughty Dog's first rodeo, with games like God of War 3 and Infamous 2 also pushing the hardware to its limits. Facial animations and expressions still to this day hold up quite well, and I didn't see any glaring issues with it or anything that pronounced itself as outdated even by today's standards, which not many games developed for the PS3 can really say. I think Uncharted's presentation was the first block placed in what would become the tower that is Naughty Dog's unrivaled, maybe only by Rockstar, level of fidelity and truly pushing the hardware that they've got to use to the fullest potential, which presents results that are as fascinating as The Last of Us Part 2, graphically speaking. The gameplay of Uncharted is pretty simplistic for the most part. It's not as creative or even as intuitive as what Naughty Dog was making before Uncharted in terms of gameplay mechanics and complexity. It's quite bare bone, but at the same time it can also be a lot of fun. There's two major aspects of the gameplay of the entirety of the Uncharted series, being the parkour and the combat. The combat is what I'll touch on first. It's some basic elements of typical third-person shooting combined with a lot of set pieces to make it more dramatic. In terms of set pieces, there's a few, with one memorable one being riding on a jet ski and using an explosive pistol to kill all the enemies in your path. Then there's the very start of the game. Drake is on a boat getting invaded by pirates, and this is where the gameplay mechanics are introduced through the use of first teaching the player about the incredibly simplistic and not very original hand-to-hand combat, which is still satisfying to pull off in combat at all times, but it's just not the greatest I've seen at all. It's a few different melee actions such as punching and kicking an enemy, and there's only one combo called the brutal combo, which can be carried out through the use of a few different button sequences. In very minuscule and certain situations, there's also the ability to sneak behind an enemy and take them out in an instant stealth kill. However, these instances are so rare that I don't even have any footage to show it, which goes to show that it really is a mechanic that is barely used in the game at all. There's not much to say about the melee combat because in its nature it's really simple, and although it can be satisfying to do in certain moments, it's definitely not the most optimal option to choose in each encounter, which usually involves groups of enemies opposed to the scarce one or two, making this mechanic almost entirely redundant. The third person shooting, on the other hand, is the first steps that Naughty Dog took to arrive at what would be their formulated response in creating games like this from now on, where the gameplay was always second to the cinematics, animations, and story behind it all. It's so basic that it can become quite repetitive, especially at the end of the game. It mainly involves going into a room or a large expanse of area and hiding behind cover while either blind firing without aim or just trying to get the lucky headshot so all your foes fall as fast as possible. In the shooting regard, it isn't anything special, and it's a criticism that I've heard is echoed through the three other installments of the franchise, although there are some mix-ups on the way. The guns are not too varied, and I only found myself really using the pistol or the shotgun because almost every other weapon runs out of ammo and doesn't do enough damage, or is just outmatched by what you can do with a few shots from the pistol or the shotgun. For me, this is a little disappointing and led to the repetitive nature that the shooting took after various hours on hours of just hiding behind cover and aiming for the heads of enemies without any apparent skill or variation involved in between them. How this could have been fixed is by adding more weapons foremost, and also giving weapons like the assault rifle a bit of boost in damage, so it didn't really make its existence useless. However, you can get a few different weapons due to the change of enemies in the latter half of the game, but they soon disappear, and again I just saw myself either using a shotgun or pistol due to the useless nature of any of the other weapons that I stumbled upon. Now let's talk about the game's parkour. Oh boy, do you do it a damn lot. It got to a point where I could predict the next section was going to be entirely climbing and parkour due to a few places on the wall behind enemies that made it evident. It's pretty fun, but nowadays parkour can feel a little more janky in this installment, but I like to compare it to a game that was released in the same year, the first Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed still offered the player some janky controls, and for both games this is in part due to the developers trying something new, but it feels more fluid to pull off. Now contrasted to that of Drake's Fortune, it feels much jankier, less fluid, and this can make the overall fun factor of this aspect of the game worsen. I think this is a fair comparison, but I think it doesn't overall take too much away from what Naughty Dog was trying to do. What makes the parkour of Uncharted different from other games is due to the epic set pieces and grand moments that makes the parkour intensify and overall make it more interesting for the player to engage in these sequences. It might not be complex and can just be pretty bad in control sometimes, especially when jumping from right to left or vice versa, or Drake somehow just missing a ledge. It can get especially annoying, but for what Naughty Dog was trying to do, they've succeeded fairly well. And of course they had a few sequels to polish and truly refine the parkour and climbing of Uncharted to truly fit their vision, but the parkour of Drake's Fortune is surely baby steps in becoming a full-grown system like what is seen in Uncharted 4 with some of its more complex and epic maneuvers. But for this game, it can suffer from such a reliance on parkour and climbing because it is such a main feature of the game. I think it might be even more existent within the game than that of the combat, so it truly was a feature that Naughty Dog wanted to shove down everyone's throats because that's one of the core aspects they believed would add further immersion and intrigue in the game, and in some aspects of it, it might have succeeded, but it's very flawed and outdated and a part of the game that doesn't hold up very well, even in relative notions to the game's other core mechanics such as the combat. Uncharted as a series is more known for its epic set pieces and the narrative that envelopes and crafts the foundation for the grand adventures of Nathan Drake to be told. Well, like they say, greatness from small beginnings is a quote that can be applied directly to the narrative of this game, and in some regards, even to the entirety of the game as a whole. Drake's Fortune presents quite a simplistic story, but it still retains a lot of the aspects that we can see in later Naughty Dog games. Well, ultimately elevates so much of the experience and narrative of Drake's Fortune is the characters, cinematics, and animations which do so well to bring the story to life, which not many video games of the time were able to do so successfully, so it was surely monumental in that aspect. I'll do a quick story synopsis of the narrative, so be warned, there'll be some spoilers in here, and then I'll revise and spout out any thoughts that I have surrounding the story in its greater connotation. Drake's Fortune follows the protagonist Nathan Drake as he finds the diary of his supposed ancestor, Sir Francis Drake, who in his lifetime had sought a lost treasure, something that Nathan himself wants a piece of. Drake goes through various tombs and ancient buildings to find clues and maps that would eventually lead him to find the treasure. But at the start of the story, the adventure takes a swift turn as Drake and Sully decide to leave a reporter known as Elena Fisher behind, as they don't want a race for gold to commence. Despite this, a treasure hunter known as Gabriel Roman manages to catch up with the pair before they had the time to really do anything, and they take Sully captive. Or to Drake, he's assumed dead, while Drake and Elena meet up to go on the grand adventure for clues to bring them to the treasure, while fighting off Roman's forces to get to their objectives. However, by the end of the game, zombie-like creatures are introduced, as the treasure is supposedly cursed and should never be retrieved, as it is what caused the mutations of these certain humans to occur. Drake stops Roman with the help of Elena and Sully, and they leave the lost treasure of El Dorado at the bottom of the ocean to stay as a remnant and curse of the island that it was discovered on. And the story ends with the three leaving for more grand adventures to be opened up, which is surely explored in later games. I personally really enjoyed the story of this game. It's quite simplistic in terms of themes, and even the overarching plot isn't anything complex, but for a lot of stories, especially ones that are going to start a grander adventure, starting with something smaller and concise will bring the reader, viewer, or player in and make them intrigued to see what else happens later in the story. I saw myself always being interested in what happens. I think a lot of this is due to the epic set moments that Uncharted is now known for, and the intensity of certain moments mixed with the more subtle and character developing moments allowed the story to feel fleshed out while still feeling like the smallest part of something grander. And I think for a series like Uncharted, this was a perfect way to start the tale of Nathan Drake. The characters are all interesting, mostly attributed to Drake himself, as well as Elena and Sully, who are awesome supporting characters that surely add a lot to the game's narrative due to the supposed dynamics with our protagonist as well as with each other, which truly creates a more complex story in the long run through these various relationships. Drake's Fortune didn't need to be a complex story, and I think if it started off with anything more complex, it would have been a bit harder for Naughty Dog to move on from, and I think sticking with the tropes that the franchise foremost wanted to establish, such as the grander nature of the narrative and as well as the primitive story component of treasure hunting, it gave this game a sense of connection to the player, and I really enjoyed playing through it, and there was a few twists and turns that made it engaging throughout the whole experience. Something I didn't like is the introduction of supernatural things such as those zombies that appear at the very latter part of the game, and I saw Uncharted more of a series that was grounded in reality instead of creatures like zombies being around. I thought aspects like those were more fitting of games like the Tomb Raider ones. It's a really small gripe, but something that I thought I'd mention nonetheless, because it did kind of annoy me. For everything else, it was well written, well constructed, and well paced. And I think Drake's Fortune story, which may not be as great as the rest of the franchise and definitely not up to par with games like The Last of Us, was a sign that Naughty Dog's talented team was surely able to create narratives that were more creative and interesting than that of previous endeavors and narratives that the team had created before Uncharted. Overall, it's a fun and intriguing story, and I'm excited to play the second of the franchise, also considered the best by many, to see how it improved upon the game in a narrative sense, and I'll surely cover that on the channel as well. Drake's Fortune to this day is still a great game. There's a lot of aspects of it which can feel outdated and have many flaws and problems which can make those particular notions of the game less enjoyable when trying to play the game today. But the core of what made Uncharted such a great series in the first place is rooted right here in its first installment. It created the foundation for the presentation and Naughty Dog's reputation in the gaming community that still stands to this day, as well as the gameplay and cover shooting mechanics that have become pretty much a mainstay in the franchise and its various other franchises, even if it is for better or for worse. And in its greatest aspects, Drake's Fortune started the grand tale of Nathan Drake, the infamous treasure hunter, and an incredibly well-written and well-rounded character. Without this game existing, a lot of games such as the new reboot Tomb Raider or The Last of Us simply wouldn't exist due to many of the implied and obvious realizations and mechanics that were taken and inspired by the Uncharted series, and this game truly does reinforce the foundation of the franchise into the future as well as its eventual place in gaming, as Nathan Drake is now an icon and Uncharted is recognized as one of the greatest gaming franchises that PlayStation has under its belt. So I do recommend that if you've never played any Uncharted game, Drake's Fortune is still a great place to start this fantastic series, and for anyone who wants to replay the game after many years, Drake's Fortune still surprisingly holds up in most aspects even today. Hi everyone, sorry for the shorter video this time around. I didn't want to drag the video on and beat around the bush, so this video ended up being a bit shorter and more concise than that of my previous videos. However, my next video on Doom Eternal should be a decent amount longer, maybe even double the size of this, so stay tuned for that. Then there shall be an in-depth analysis of the first 2 chapters of Deltarune, a game that I'm excited to cover in detail on the channel. I won't spout out any other plans, but I want to ensure that the content now will be quite long, which means the time between videos might be longer as well, meaning that there could be as long as a 2-week gap between sequential videos, but do not fret, as I am ensuring the utmost high quality when it comes to these retrospectives of these old and also newer games. Anyway, I think that's it from me for today. I hope you all have a great day and an awesome week. Peace.